nicotine improves cognitive performance. It is Good morning, friends. In this video, I'm going to tell you why nicotine is a performance-enhancing drug that may also protect your health. But before I do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video to help the channel's growth. Now let's get started. First of all, friends, I recently made a video about nasal snuff, which is nasal tobacco, and sometime around that time I received a question from a subscriber who is, I think, a student intending to use nicotine to improve his ability to study or perform exams. He asked me, how should I supplement nicotine to improve my performance? And what I decided to do was make a first video introducing you to the subject of why would you want to add nicotine into your daily regimen in the first place. And the second video, which will be released this afternoon at 12 p.m. PST, I'll tell you how I go about optimizing nicotine supplementation as well as related factors. What I do personally and what I think others should do, and the considerations in building their own plans. Now let's get started. First, we have to introduce nicotine. To understand more about nicotine, I'd highly recommend you check out my series in the playlist section called the Cholinergic series. If you haven't watched it, I'll briefly introduce it to you here. The issue that how to understand how nicotine works in our body, mainly, you need to understand something called the cholinergic system. Basically, there's a part of our diet that we consume, often in meat or in eggs or in various other sources, called choline. Choline is actually a vitamin. When you consume choline, your body attaches an acetyl group from something called acetyl-CoA to the choline to produce a neurotransmitter that's active in our nervous systems called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine then signals at two kinds of receptors, the cholinergic receptors. But the receptors are they're named separately, two groups, according actually to whether nicotine also agonizes them. Interestingly, nicotine, a molecule found in plants, including tobacco, binds to and activates a subset of our human nicotinic cholinergic, not a subset of our cholinergic receptors called the nicotinic cholinergic receptors. So what does this really mean? This means nicotine acts like a hormone that's naturally present in your brain and nervous system. It acts just like it in some aspects. It binds to and activates some of the gene transcription controlling receptors that acetylcholine also binds to and activates. So you can think of nicotine sort of akin to how cabergoline, for the bodybuilders, is related to dopamine, or how halotestin, a little bit different, halotestin or anavar is related to testosterone or DHT. The nicotine is an analog of acetylcholine that does some of its activities. Next, we have to distinguish between tobacco and nicotine, and between smoking and tobacco also. Smoking anything is very harmful for your body and puts your body in an inflammatory state. Tobacco also, depending on how it's cured, can have some carcinogenic compounds in it. So although smokers do have better cognition often, they have better cognition despite the smoke. It's the nicotine that causes them to have better cognition, the nicotine in the tobacco, whereas the smoke increases their inflammation. So when smokers smoke more, they get worse cognition, but that's not just, well, we'll find out later, partially because of the nicotine, but mainly because of the inflammation. Next, let's talk about how nicotine affects cognition. We're not going to be very comprehensive here because there are very many measures of cognitive performance. But let me tell you that nicotine improves cognitive performance across mammals, across a variety of tests of cognitive performance. And it does so consistently in a U-shaped curve, such that less nicotine is worse, but too much nicotine is also worse. So even in humans that are nicotine naive, that don't smoke, even in people that have never used nicotine before, 2 milligrams of nicotine gum will improve their cognitive performance acutely, whereas 4 milligrams will worsen it compared to not taking anything, and compared to taking 2 milligrams. So there's a U-shaped curve with nicotine's effect on cognitive performance. Now, why might nicotine improve cognitive performance? Well, there's a few reasons we might think it does. In fact, there's quite a few. I'll just focus on 3 here. The first is a change in brain resting states. So your brain has connective networks that are visible on fMRI scans. Some of these networks you actually probably know about, even though you may not have heard of them explicitly. For example, mindfulness meditation, being mindful of your environment without thinking of something consciously, is the attempt to introduce and empower what's called the salience network, which recognizes salient aspects of your environment or life, empower that and weaken the default mode network. When you're in a train and you're looking out the window and you're just thinking about something without meaning to, that's your default mode network. The default mode network is thought to play a causal role in the development of depression and various other diseases of the brain. Nicotine weakens the predominance of the default mode network and strengthens the salience network, which switches from the default mode network to the executive control network. That's the focus network that you use on an exam. So, nicotine does something similar actually to mindfulness meditation in that sense. But also nicotine controls catecholamine transmission. You see, the catecholamine related neurons in the midbrain of mammals is rich in, or they are rich in nicotinic cholinergic receptors. And nicotinic cholinergic receptor agonism is related to and modulates the dopamine network. Nicotine administration across mammals causes acute dopamine transmission. For those of you that don't know, what is one of the main tools used to improve cognitive performance? Adderall or some kind of, or methylphenidate, Ritalin. These are drugs that modulate the dopamine system. Well, nicotine does also. One of the reasons it may be addictive, but also one of the reasons it's cognitive enhancing. And finally, the third reason I wanted to point out is simply its modulation of the nicotinic cholinergic receptors. The cholinergic system is integral to memory development and formation, and it is the main modulator of our memory systems in our brains. Next, you may be surprised to know that nicotine also affects our mood and depression. In fact, there is a very well-developed, actually, cholinergic hypothesis of depression, and nicotine administration is mood-enhancing acutely. In fact, interestingly, light smokers have less depression than non-smokers, but also less than heavy smokers. So the nicotine is involved in our mood as well. And finally, regarding our health, although most of you think of nicotine as being unhealthy, what you're really thinking of is smoking. As I said earlier, smoking, combustion in general, consuming things that are combusted, but also tobacco has carcinogenic elements to it. Nonetheless, because nicotine is so neuroprotective, smokers have massively reduced rates of brain disease, of Parkinson's disease, dementia, and even Alzheimer's disease. This isn't true for all brain diseases, like ALS, for example, what Stephen Hawking's had. Brain diseases that are very much modulated by inflammation, their incidence may get worse, like ALS. But the nicotinic cholinergic stimulation from nicotine preserves brain health. In fact, the first-line drug to treat memory deficits in people who have Alzheimer's disease is a drug that inhibits the breakdown of the natural hormone that nicotine mimics, acetylcholine. So the main drug used to treat Alzheimer's disease memory issues is a drug that makes acetylcholine more present in the brain, sort of mimicking the effect of taking nicotine, partially. That drug, by the way, is called donepezil, and we'll be talking about it again this afternoon. So, to conclude, what did we learn here? We learned that nicotine improves cognitive performance, it is mood enhancing, and it is potently neuroprotective. And we learned that nicotine seems to have a U-shaped curve with most of these effects. In the next video this afternoon, I'll tell you how I go about supplementing with nicotine and other supplements to optimize my cognition acutely. Thank you so much, friends. I look forward to seeing you again this afternoon.